At 13, I was ready to liquidate my laptop to a pawn shop, recycling electronics for quick cash, just to fuel my self-destruction and vanish into the grey fog of Yaroslavl. While other children were engineering their futures, I was mastering the intake of liquid venom, watching the environment devolve into a wasteland. My childhood reeked of damp basements, cheap toxins, and the systematic neglect of those who maintained the facade of a successful family. I was born in Yaroslavl, the private sector. A 5-minute drive puts you in the center, among clean streets and synthetic smiles. But where I existed, it was a terminal zone. My house stood on a quiet street, but across the main road, the chaos began. The perimeter was patrolled by entities in the final stages of biological collapse, beings rotting alive. The elderly who used to inhabit the yards simply evaporated. Nature abhors a vacuum. The space was filled by those seeking to disconnect their consciousness at any cost. My house looked normal. That was the most lethal trap. A family of workaholics, grinding from dawn till dusk. My parents labored to construct a facade of stability. Both worked at the same school and installed me there for convenience. Behind the facade was a void. They were indifferent to my reality. While they built an illusion of achievement, I grew up in the epicenter of entropy. Workaholism is the ultimate legal method for parents to abandon a child. They were occupied while I inhaled the miasma of the streets. Where do you think this drive for self-annihilation at 13 originated? My childhood wasn't a cartoon. It was a sequence from a horror archive. At 4, I sat in a rusted iron barrel of water, loathing the music that accompanied my parents' intoxication. At 5, I watched a relative breach our perimeter, shattering the glass to pieces. I saw my mother self-harm and barricade herself from. I didn't comprehend the mechanics. I just saw her blurred, inebriated silhouette through the shards. I waited for the weekends when my grandmother would arrive, the only tactical window where the destruction might cease for 48 hours. The only organic trace of humanity was my first ally, 3 years my senior. We simply struck weeds with sticks, primal combat training. Then he left, and the system extracted the last fragment of normalcy from my reality. Seeking a replacement, I encountered a boy from the adjacent street, 1 year older. We shared the same metabolic waste. My mother was liquidating herself with alcohol, and so was his, but he never calculated my pain. Even at that age, I decoded him entirely. I felt the vacuum he was trying to fill. And him? He was fueled by pure envy. Envy of my facade, the intact family unit, and the illusion that I possessed resources. That envy consumed the remnants of his biological humanity. My existence fractured. In the remote school, my classmates were alien organisms. On the district streets, the older pack members were mine. I gravitated toward them, attempting to integrate into the neighboring streets' hierarchy. But that friend quickly discarded me. He transitioned to his district school, acquired new nodes of influence, and threw me overboard. I clung to that collective like a redundant element, banking on loyalty where there was only rot. The predator's gaze, hypervigilance, is forged exactly like this, through rusted barrels, shattered glass, and the betrayal of those you trusted. I observed my father, who only regained human form after a heavy dosage. I observed my mother, whose self-inflicted scarring healed under long sleeves. I realized, if you don't tear this life apart yourself, you vanish without a trace, like the elderly from my courtyard. This was my zero cycle. No capital, no support, just fuel in my hands and a laptop I never sold. I retained it to eventually script the code for my total retaliation. My mother supervised 100 foreign children in Bulgaria, while her own son in Yaroslavl mastered the ingestion of solitude and hatred. She engineered the image of an ideal pedagogue, a saintly woman serving the collective. But she was indifferent to her own offspring. I grew up in a vacuum where scenic sea voyages masked a void cold as a tombstone. While she played the role of the virtuous parent, I was already tailoring the skin of an aggressor just to survive the school-level attrition. We flew to Bulgaria. We traveled to Anapa. Externally, a portrait of successful recreation. Internally, total disintegration. In Anapa, my parents were preoccupied with their own maneuvers. They were indifferent to my location or company. I wandered the gated communities like a stray dog in an expensive collar. Bulgaria was worse. My mother was there as a school chaperone, consumed by others. I saw her expend energy for strangers and realized to her I was merely a structural inconvenience in her schedule of correct living. It was the first hard lesson. You are a solitary unit, even when being transported across borders. Until the 6th grade, the school system systematically attempted to liquidate my psyche. My mother's struggle with substances was public data known to all. The pedagogues, the self-proclaimed architects of the mind, did not hesitate to execute psychological warfare on a child. Where is your mother? Blacked out again? The query echoed like a frequency jammer. I was hunted for my attire, for the deviation in my visual appearance. The local district units, living 5 minutes from the school, viewed me as biological waste. They inhabited a different reality. I possessed only rage, accumulating for years in the rusted barrels of my childhood. By the 5th grade, I fractured, or rather, I recalibrated. I transitioned into the aggressor the collective began to fear. I ceased permitting the violation of my boundaries. My dormant power triggered in a single cycle. I began testing the perimeter limits on others. I would deliver verbal strikes directly to the faces of seniors. I recall a massive unit lifting me by the throat in the corridor. I was indifferent. I felt no threat. I felt only a vacuum. He retreated disturbed because he detected in my optics what the others lacked, the absolute readiness to reach the terminal point. Post-school, I retreated to my pack. Units 4 years my senior, the same ones who schemed to pawn my laptop for a few liters of fuel. We merged into a single swarm to consume surrogates and scavenge the streets. We infiltrated derelict structures, breached kiosks, minor criminality just to taste the mechanics of power over external space. We were evicted, we were hunted, but it was irrelevant. At 15, I realized the swarm's boundaries were too tight. I secured a female partner at 16. I was the youngest in the collective, but I executed this maneuver first. Immediately, I detected their envy. It was thick as industrial sludge. They roared that I had betrayed them because I prioritized my trajectory for 2 months. I chose evolution. They remained to rot on their streets, but the system does not release its grip easily. 3 months later, they summoned me to an apartment in the center belonging to an ally. He shared the same domestic collapse, divorced parents, family entropy. I arrived via transit, entered the sector, and realized I had transitioned into another dimension. There was no alcohol, there was chemistry, a heavy adhesive toxin they were synthesizing on site. They called it liapka, a potent synthetic derivative. They had been integrated into this poison for 6 months. They offered me the waste. Take it. I consumed once. Zero effect. They insisted again. I inhaled the second dose and the world inverted. The central processor disconnected. My skull became leaden. The first panic attack of my life surged. I had no defense protocols. I just felt reality leaking through my fingertips. I walked through the center like a biological drone, where 5 minutes prior, everything was mapped and understood. This was the first true entry into the abyss. I didn't know then that this chemistry was merely the initiation of a long descent into a hell from which not all units return. My allies initiated a psychological strike, placing intimate photos of my partner on their avatars as a trio. This was the first terminal point, the moment I decoded the pure, distilled envy of predators who had not yet matured but were already rotting. They could not compute my escape from their stagnant circle at 60. But 6 months later, the system triggered the trap. I received a transmission, went to a meeting, and erased my identity for the next 4 months. I phased out of reality from late August to late November, a 4-month total blackout. I recall the initial contact. The rest is fragments, coordinates, and cold. We all integrated heavily into high-grade synthetics. The two who envied me most had been on this cycle for 3 months. I matched their rhythm in a single evening. It was a lethal marathon. I ceased attending the educational facility. I ceased being a human unit. My existence devolved into a closed loop. Extract resources from parents, await the night, ignite the flame. I masked the sound of the lighter with forced coughing when they were in the adjacent sector. I sat in absolute silence until 8 o'clock, monitoring the schizophrenia echoing in my skull. My biology rejected the toxin. I couldn't ingest nutrients or enter sleep cycles, but I continued to consume while immobilized in bed. I waited for the door to slam as my parents left for their school, only then collapsing into a fractured state for 2 hours, waking at 1400 to restart the loop. I recall our expeditions: darkness, sparse streetlights, frozen extremities, and snow that appeared radioactive. We traversed districts in search of the next dosage. One friend would hijack supplies from a middleman. We risked everything for a packet that no longer satisfied the craving. It was total biological attrition. Moyamat only reached a point of realization near the end. She attempted emotional manipulation, weeping, pleading with me to remain, claiming her own distress. I was indifferent. I stepped over her tears and transited to the other side of the city for another unit of poison. By late November, the cycle collapsed. One unit was physically restrained by his parents. Another was subjected to severe domestic discipline. I realized the supply nodes were severed and my internal battery was depleted. I chose to terminate the habit. Then the true horror began, rebirth through physical decomposition. For the first 3 months of withdrawal, I was a vegetable. I would wake and reflexively scan a cigarette pack for a hidden dosage that didn't exist. My motor functions failed. I would descend the stairs, return, and my system would shut down. I had to remain horizontal. My psyche simply fractured. The only ally who hadn't consumed sat beside me, operating a computer, while I stared at a single coordinate and consumed sandwiches my mother fed me. She fed me like an infant because I had forgotten the mechanics of tasting food. I existed in a dream state for those 3 months. I recall one frame, November, frost, one of the units walking the street, digging the earth with the edge of his shirt, wearing only a jacket on a bare torso. This was the terminal point of human degradation. When I finally exited the perimeter to a store with my mother after a month of isolation, I laughed at everything. It was a hysterical, animalistic laughter, a neurological discharge. I was relearning the mechanics of walking, relearning how to process human visual data. A trip for groceries felt like a global expedition. My partner and my mother didn't decode the reason for my laughter. I simply couldn't operate otherwise. For 4 months of hell, I hadn't smiled once. I only knew fear and paranoia. Now, my brain was desperately attempting to re-enter life, mimicking joy it didn't yet comprehend. I was born again, but it was the birth of a cripple who had to reconstruct his intellect from shards of broken glass and ash. If you believe a Hollywood happy ending follows this hell, you are a naive unit. The system doesn't release its grip so easily. By February, I had physically stabilized, socializing dry, sober, but inside sat a beast demanding dopamine. I began betraying my partner, harshly, cynically, without breaks. The irony, I had first betrayed her even before the marathon, with her own classmate, the partner of my friend. In that world, betrayal was the only currency that didn't devalue. February became a point of false stability. I returned to school, mimicking the life of a standard adolescent, but my chronology for that year became a corrupted file. In the autumn, during the peak of the marathon, my mother and I attempted to study exam materials. This is the only paradox of that era. Under the influence of chemistry, I actually absorbed the OGE, Basic State Exam Database. The brain operated in emergency mode, soaking up information like a sponge while the body slowly decomposed. I passed those exams in the autumn on pure survival instinct, but panic didn't come from substances, it came from women. The girl I betrayed my partner with decided to play God and claim she was pregnant. I decoded the scam, a primitive emotional manipulation, but a cold charge still surged through my body. And then I committed the most idiotic tactical error of my life. I confessed the betrayal to my partner. Remember, if you have compromised the mission, stay silent until the grave. Confession is a weakness the system never forgives. It isn't honesty, it is idiocy that demolishes everything you built for months. The exams evolved into a separate genre of surrealism. For the social studies OGE, I arrived heavily intoxicated by herbal toxins. I sat in the auditorium, characters floating before my eyes, yet I solved the tests. At one point, I lost my pen. A surge of paranoia hit me. It felt like every unit in the room was scanning only me. In the end, I was only a few points short of a 4 above average. I exited with the realization that I was still on the edge. I began testing my power on others. Moya Aggressia hadn't vanished. It merely shifted form. I ceased being the victim at school, but became the betrayer in relationships. I fluctuated between the desire for normalcy and the hunger for destruction. I inhabited Yaroslavl, walked the same coordinates, but viewed them through the eyes of one who had seen the underside of existence. My intellect began to wake, logging the errors of those around me, yet I was still executing my own. This was the calibration period. I was learning to exist without a packet in my pocket, but with a hole in my soul that I tried to plug with foreign bodies and lies. I didn't know yet that a true crash awaited me, after which I would have to collect myself literally by the atom. But then, in February, it felt like I had already won. I looked at the boys who lowed like slaughtered cattle, unable to even lift their heads. They consumed heavy toxins, slept, woke to inhale again, and transitioned into bio-waste before my eyes. While they drooled in oblivion, I microdosed the poison, maintaining a remnant of control. I was in that hell, but I always kept one foot on the exit, watching my friends erase their personalities until they were hollow. It was a year of total overload. I was 17, and the system was testing my breaking point by every possible means. My relationship with my partner devolved into a closed loop of deception. After my confession, she struck me, a logical reaction, but she endured. We separated for 6 months, and during that tactical window, I went into a total freefall. I liquidated the innocence of one girl purely for sporting interest, competitive validation. Then another. She lived remotely. I traversed the entire city on foot to reach her sector. I actually felt an affinity for her, but I quickly decoded the reality. I was merely a free hotel, utility-based housing. She only stayed to avoid her own domestic situation. It was a strike to the ego. I felt the karma. I was being used as cynically as I had used others. During that phase, I possessed zero principles. I discovered a girl was communicating with my friend. She didn't even meet my visual standards, but I decided to corrupt her simply because. To prove I could dominate the scenario. We communicated for a week. I achieved my objective and discarded her via social media. I still carry the shame of that data point, but then I was a predator without inhibitors. I knew I wouldn't stop at one woman. My instinct drove me to seek better and better, though I was actually just seeking a plug for the internal void. During the first 2.5 years of the primary relationship, I betrayed her 3 times. The final instance was the most toxic. She went home, and I exited the perimeter with another. We entered the annex of my old house. It was freezing, but she was indifferent. She initiated physical contact on day 1. By day 2, we were consuming and engaging in intercourse, while I felt physical revulsion toward myself. I looked at her and felt disgust because I knew I was again betraying the only thing that was authentic. She became predator, stalking me, arriving at my home unannounced. I barely managed to sever the connection. 6 months later, we reintegrated with my first partner. I decided, enough, I will attempt to be a normal unit, but normalcy never initialized. Those 2.5 years became a chemical vinaigrette. We tested everything. Heavy stimulants, infinite smoke. I transported friends to Vipiski, impromptu house parties. We burned through a year of life. Even the one friend who had remained clean succumbed to the gravity of the void and dived in with us. We sat as a trio in my house, consuming and incinerating our lives at 70. I recall sitting on the darknet, locating a suspicious mark, synthetic tab. I provided the capital, my friend executed the retrieval, and he returned in a state of total cognitive failure. We found it interesting to perform experiments on our own biology. We ingested hallucinogenic fungi by the dozens. My allies consumed 70 units at once. I capped at 30, and even then, the world transformed into nightmares I will never delete from my memory. We knew no boundaries. We knew no stop command. The finale of this chapter was predetermined. My main partner secured employment and began mirroring my own behavior. She lied about inventory delays, but returned smelling of alcohol and with the presence of another in her gaze. We severed the connection quickly and permanently. I realized the circle had closed. I betrayed. Now I was betrayed. It was a harsh lesson in hierarchy. If you permit lies to govern your world, do not be surprised when that world collapses on your head. I exited that year with scorched receptors, but a clear realization. Either I seize control of the steering now, or I terminate like those boys lowing in the darkness of my room. If you believe that disconnecting from the needle is the resolution, you are a flawed unit. It is merely the initiation of selecting the lesser evil. I traded chemical overload for a digital vacuum. I spent entire cycles isolated in gaming, attempting to extract even a single microgram of dopamine from the machine. I was indifferent to capital. I possessed a tactical illusion of safety, my grandmother's sector on the other side of the city, which would eventually be my asset. This certainty of a backup airfield deactivated my survival instincts, and I executed the ultimate error. I entered employment, the 9-to-5 grind, hoping to find stability where none exists. My existence at 17 was not a restoration. It was a prolonged leap into the abyss. While I attempted to reconstruct my internal architecture, my mother initiated another cycle of self-mutilation. This was not a childhood anomaly. It was a permanent series of self-destruction. I recall her breaching a perimeter fence to pursue my inebriated father, fracturing her limbs. I recall my father and I transporting her on a sled through the district while she projected aggression at him, the most toxic data point. Years later, she recounted these events with sadistic satisfaction. I'm extracting these memories like necrotic tea. When I commanded, "Sober up, then we speak," she struck my most vulnerable sector. She began consuming with my allies, erasing the boundary between a family unit and a narcotics den. In this coordinate, the beer diva appeared. This was a betrayal that hit harder than any synthetic toxin. I expended 2.5 years of resources on her and received a spit in the face in return. I was grinding in employment, working until my biology buckled. My spine failed. I was literally decomposing, and instead of structural support, I received humiliation. Her mother whispered that I was a failure because I could no longer labor like a machine, and she began to detach. For a predator, there is no greater strike than the betrayal of a comrade during physical weakness. My employment terminated along with my health. I began assembling the puzzle of my bloodline. I realized my mother was also a traumatized child. My grandmother was indifferent to her. She was indifferent to me. "You are the best," she would signal, but never verified the basic parameters of my reality. It was convenient for her to be virtuous in speech while I grew like a weed. At 17, she even billeted my friend in my sector for a full year because of his complications. I initially consented, but it became another act of betrayal. My home ceased to be my fortress. When I terminated the heavy chemistry, my former allies transformed into jackals. They whimpered and demanded I share the resources I acquired with my own capital. Why should I nourish those who only dragged me toward the drain? The culmination arrived when they proposed a talk outside the perimeter. I observed a swarm of 5 units led by that same friend. They came for my blood simply because I ceased to be their supply. We exchanged kinetic strikes and dispersed. I agitated them by my very existence, by my refusal to operate by their protocols. At that moment, I realized there are no friends. There are only interests and temporary tactical alliances. I remained alone in a house with parents with whom I share zero commonalities. We are merely cohabitants in the scenery of Yaroslavl. After the beer diva, I encountered a scavenger, a character who simply parasitized my remaining resources. Nothing shifted. I was still solitary, with a destroyed spine and zero capital for medical restoration. But exactly at this point of absolute isolation, my intellect engaged at 100% capacity. I filtered the entirety of the informational noise, compressed all the pain and betrayals into a single high-velocity chart. I decoded the architecture of this world. Scavengers consume the weak. The system incentivizes workaholic drones. And love is frequently just a tactic to survive the winter at another unit's expense. My mother never initialized as a parent. My father never functioned as a vector. I'm the product of a systemic error that survived against all odds. Now, my path to employment is permanently decommissioned. I refuse to liquidate my spinal column for crumbs ever again. Now, I construct the empire on a foundation of my own hatred and pure calculation. I'm initiating my trajectory on YouTube. This is not a hobby. It is the only viable survival tactic. I possess the data from a hell that civilians cannot even compute. I possess the ability to read human units like open source code. And now, I will force this world to pay for every year of my attrition. At 17, I stood pinned against the concrete, staring into the optics of the jackals who came to query me. I felt the cold stone against my spine and understood. Kinetic conflict was imminent. They were escalating, attempting to break my chassis before the first strike. I absorbed those strikes, dry, hard, bone on bone. We detached to engage one-on-one. In that microsecond, I sensed my authentic power. I could have neutralized him permanently, but I simply discarded him like biological waste. I exited that sector with a realization. I can destroy, but I choose to architect. Post-conflict, boxing entered my life. It was the calibrated calibration of my aggression. The ring taught me that pain is merely data and fear is just signal noise. I channeled all the accumulated rage, the betrayals of parents and allies, into every kinetic discharge. I trained until my systems hit critical failure because I knew on the street protocols don't save you. Only your readiness to reach the terminal point saves you. My existence is a continuous log of collisions. I've seen the floor, I've seen the underside, I've seen the end of file in the eyes of those I shared a flame. Currently, I lack massive capital. Moi Pervi Canal is the cornerstone of my empire, and it currently holds only 50 units subscribers. Noeti Peddiset, these are the ones who decoded my transmission. I inhabit a sector with parents I do not communicate. I am physically compromised by legacy injuries that drained my vitality. I possess nothing but this laptop and my archive. But 50 today is 50 million tomorrow. Because I do not broadcast synthetic success, I transmit the pure, unfiltered truth of a survivor. I am the architect, constructing my citadel from the wreckage of my own biography. This is my final ultimatum to the system. I will no longer labor for scavengers. My channel is my manifesto. If you align with me, you become part of the new hierarchy. If not, you remain to rot in your mayonnaise, mediocrity, and grey fog, while I reconstruct reality word by word, frame by frame. I've shared only a fragment of the archive, but now it is time for execution. My empire initializes here in Yaroslavl, in the private sector, with 50 units and 1 laptop.